Occasionally, I will accuse my wife of using me as her emotional Sherpa. You guys know what a Sherpa is, right? That's when you're like, you want to climb to the top of Mount Everest, and there's the people who live around the base of the mountain, and you can hire them to carry your gear. That is essentially my role in my marriage. My wife is extremely busy. She owns and operates a performance venue, not unlike Caveat. And the people, as I'm sure they could tell you, it's very stressful. There's the health department. There's, staffing issues. Things break all the time. And so it usually seems like my wife is carrying around 15 pounds of anxiety in a 10-pound bag. And that is where I step in, me, Tenzing Norgay reborn. What will happen is my wife will offload some of her anxiety onto me, which will then allow her to go about her life and get done the shit that needs to get done. And I'm not complaining about this. It's something I'm rather good at. And if any of you are a person like this, it's not hard. You don't need to do much to be an emotional Sherpa. All you really need to do is to be present. Like physically, but more importantly, emotionally. When your partner's upset, you have to listen to them. And not just listen, but absorb the actual anxiety that is coming out of them. Like when my wife is angry, I have to get angry to relieve some of that for her. I have to suck it out of her like a magnet. When she's sad, I need to be sad. And then I take all that excess emotion and I stuff it down really deep where no one can find it. And I only release it when I am watching a Knicks game and I can scream at the television. That is just how I process it. You might process it somehow differently. Now, I like to joke that that is my wife's fault that she's doing it, but she knows that this has kind of always been my thing. It's how I've distinguished myself amongst other men. I have never been the smartest. I've never been the coolest. I've never been a hard worker, particularly. But I do know how to carry weight. That is my gift. And I was not always as self-aware about this as I am now. When I was in high school and college, I would ask myself, why is it that every girl wants to unload her heavy shit on me? It must be that I'm in the theater. Which I was. I went to a performing arts high school, and I went to NYU, Tisch School of the Arts, same with Kevin. And let's not woo for Tisch, but let's be real here. They don't need that. But I always thought, like, oh, clearly it's because I'm in the arts, all of my girlfriends are maybe more dramatic than the average person. And so I was very excited when I started dating Caroline. Caroline was a finance major, which I know, ew. But I'd never dated anyone like Caroline before. She was beautiful, and she was mature. She was 2 years older than I was, which is a big deal when you're in college, And she treated me like a dirtbag, but in the best possible way. Does that make sense? Like, she was my first finance major, and I was her first artist. And she thought I was like the bad boy from the wrong side of the tracks. Like, there was a song I used to love at the time by a songwriter named Shannon Worrell called Poor Boy. And the chorus of the song went, money feels dirty, and I need a poor boy to keep me clean. And I thought of myself as being her poor boy. Which, of course, is hilarious, because I grew up in suburban Massachusetts, and I could afford to attend NY-fucking-U. Not a day in my life have I ever been poor. At worst, I was like, I don't want to have to call my dad again poor. But you could not have convinced me of this in 1994. At the time, I was living on the cutting edge. I was Lou Reed circa 1976. I was her struggling artist, and Caroline was to be my normie queen. So I thought, okay, she's a finance person, so I'm not gonna have to deal with any of that heavy emotional stuff this time. Well, this is funny. I did not know this, but apparently it is possible for someone to work in finance and still have a complicated inner life. I know. Shocking, it's true. Now, I know I've been joking around a lot, and I'm sorry that I kind of have to just say this because to move the story forward, and it's kind of heavy, and I don't mean to make light of it. So if it feels like I'm being flippant about this, please know it's only because I'm a horrible person. About 6 weeks into my relationship with Caroline, she started suddenly uncovering repressed memories of years upon years of sexual abuse that she had suffered at the hands of her father. And again, not trying to make light of that, but it's how it happened. And when she confronted her father about this, he never admitted it or denied it. He just suddenly started sending her $500 a month without ever explaining why. This was essentially payoffs. He would just start sending her money. Now, of course, to Caroline, this felt like blood money, and she didn't want to save this, and so she would spend that money by taking me out to dinner all the time, her poor boy. And so what would happen is that she would take me to a fancy restaurant, or what I considered to be a fancy restaurant at the time. It was my first time having a Caesar salad. And we would order salads, and we would order appetizers, and we would order entrees, and then Caroline would order a second entree, and I would ask her to stop, and she would say, I have to do this, and then she would order maybe a third entree, and then she would order 2 desserts, and then she would excuse herself to go to the ladies' room with a toothbrush that she always carried in her bag at all times to stick one end down her throat and the other end to clean herself up afterwards. This lasted about a year. This was our relationship. It was a year, which is an eternity when you're 20 years old. Now, this may shock you. Our relationship did not end well. I made the mistake of moving into her apartment, even though she was just starting an internship at a Wall Street firm. And what I discovered is dating a dirtbag isn't quite so romantic when you come home from your long day at a Wall Street office and you find your artist writing shitty poetry in his underwear at 7 in the evening. So she started sleeping with a day trader at her company. In fact, not only sleeping with him, like rubbing it in my face. Like she brought him back to the apartment. Because one of the things I think, if you've ever dealt with someone who's gone through stuff, is that damaged people tend to damage people. It's just how they express the damage that they have personally felt. So I moved out of the apartment, and I moved on with my life, and we had about a 7-month period where we didn't speak at all. But somehow, over time, we ended up actually being friends. And cut to about 2 years later, we hung out all the time. We had both graduated from college at this point. Caroline had taken a job at a Wall Street firm, and I was making my mark as New York City's shittiest waiter. And we decided to give our relationship another go. And my thinking was, you know what? Clean slate this time. She hadn't done the toothbrush thing in months. She seemed to be in a really good place. I didn't feel like I was going to bring her back to that place. And we weren't living together. We weren't even in the same borough at this point. I had moved up to Morningside Heights, and she had moved off to, at the time, very strange and foreign land known only as Astoria. By the way, my current home of 17 plus years. But at the time, nobody was moving to Astoria in 1995. So, and she had her own apartment. That's what made this amazing. She was the first person I knew who actually had her own, and when I say own apartment, I mean like no roommates, none. And so I started dating her, and it felt like a genuine adult relationship, and I loved it. The only downside was that every once in a while, I would get like an 11:30 phone call. She was working Wall Street hours, so she would be working, 9 in the morning till 9 at night, and then sometimes she would go back to her apartment, and she would be very lonely, and she would call me and ask me to come over. And, a good Sherpa is always on call. And so I would then have to get on the 19 at 110th Street and then go down to 42nd and then change trains and get on the end, take it all the way out to the Ditmar stop, walk 10 minutes to her place, and then by the time I got there, she'd already be asleep. That's generally the way it worked for the first few months of Act 2 of our relationship. So I started to resent having to go out there. On this particular night, I resented it a lot because it was 3 days after the blizzard of '96, which at the time was the 3rd biggest snowstorm in New York City history. And she called, and I could tell that she was drunk, like more drunk than I'd ever heard her in my life. She was slurring her words, and I did not want to have to go out there. But she kept saying, I'm scared. I need you to come over. I'm scared. And so the subway was not an option because there were still roads that weren't plowed, so the NW was completely fucked at the time, so there's no way to get out there. So that meant that I, Mr. Poor Boy Waiter Kid, had to take a livery car for $37. $1996. I bought a house a few years ago, and that caused me less anxiety than hearing the words $37 come out of the livery cab driver's mouth. But I got into the car, And because roads were closed, we got lost, and it took me almost an hour to get out to Astoria. But one way or another, I finally I got to her apartment, and I trudged through 18 inches of fresh snow in my Chuck Taylor canvas sneakers. And I went into her apartment, and I said, Caroline? No answer. Fucking damn it, she's asleep. I was like, how dare she make me come all the way out here? But the lights were on. Why would the lights be on if she was asleep? So I was like, all right, I'll turn off the lights, and then I'll crawl into bed. But first, I might as well go take a leak. And so I went into the bathroom, and Caroline was in the bathtub. And I could see her face. Her face was above the water, but the rest of her body was hidden under a pool of just red, opaque water. And her nose was just bubbling above the surface. And literally as I walked into the bathroom, her nose sunk under the water. And I have a hard time piecing together exactly what happened at this point. I do remember that I plunged my arms into the tub, and I scooped her up under the armpits, and I pulled her onto the bathroom floor. I remember the sound of her skin hitting the bathroom tiles, like I was pulling like a prize tuna onto the deck of a fishing boat, just a whap sound. And I was holding her in my arms, and I was like shaking her, and I started patting her face, and then she wasn't responding. And so I started like slapping her and pinching her and pulling her hair and screaming just anything to get her to respond. And she looked pale, but she didn't look blue. She looked pink. Because she was completely pale, but she had like bloody water all over her face, and it gave her this strange look, kind of like an actress in a colorized movie, like Judy Garland in the colorized version of The Wizard of Oz, except, naked and covered with blood. And finally, I was able to get her to react, and her reaction, when she came to, she was actually annoyed by me. She just kept saying, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And so I picked her up, and I dragged her from the bathroom to the kitchen, her heels just dragging blood across the hardwood. And I brought her into the kitchen, and I propped her up against the fridge. And she kept saying, I just want to lay down. I just want to lay down. I was like, you can't lay down. You have to stay up. And so I kept trying to go through the kitchen drawers to find something, and then she kept falling, and I'd have to hold her with one arm while I looked for anything. And finally, I found a roll of duct tape. And I just took it, and I started wrapping it around her wrist. She had 3-inch gashes, vertical gashes going up each of her arms. And I wrapped it as tight as I could. And the thing that kills me the most about this is that I didn't put fucking towels on her arm first. I wrapped duct tape around her naked flesh. And so whatever happened once she got admitted, sorry, it's the part of it that bothers me. It's of all the things I handled, I can't believe that I was too stupid to just get a dish rag or something to protect her skin, but I didn't. So at this point, I was able to kind of stanch the bleeding, and Caroline was coming to a little bit, and she was starting to become a little lucid. And she refused to let me call an ambulance because she had just moved into the apartment 2 months previous, and she did not want her neighbors talking about her. And if anybody has ever lived in Astoria with a Greek landlord, she kind of had a point. They're chatty Cathys. And so that meant that we had to travel the 10-minute walk to the Ditmar stop where all the livery cabs would congregate. But if there's one thing a Sherpa is good at, it's a long trek through the snow. So I gathered up her stuff, and I put some clothes on her, and we left the apartment, and what should have been a 10-minute walk ended up being more about 30 minutes because of the elements. We were just literally having to step through 18 inches of snow. And then she got very giddy and manic, and she started jumping up and down and throwing snow on my face, and she was hopping from one foot to the other, pretending to be Jack Skeleton from The Nightmare Before Christmas, because she wanted to make light of it. And she kept making fun of me that I was taking her to the hospital. She's like, I have gauze. I'm like, this is not, should have told me that before I got the duct tape. But I piled her into her cab, and I just said, take me to a hospital, just any hospital. And so by the time we actually got to Elmhurst Hospital, she was pretty lucid at that point. In fact, she was acting quote unquote normal, to the extent that I actually did wonder, am I overreacting here? Am I being silly? Did we even need to come here? Am I wrong? And we went up to the emergency room desk, and the woman said, what's the emergency? And I just held up her arm, and I said, she cut herself. And Caroline said, accidentally. So the woman said, go sit down. And so that's why we found ourselves sitting in the waiting room, and 1 minute before I felt like I'd been staring into the face of death, and now I was sitting under flickering fluorescent lights watching an episode of Sister, Sister. So we waited about a half an hour until finally they admitted her, and once they admitted Caroline, I went back to the apartment and I tried to clean up the scene as best I could. I mopped up all the blood, I threw out all the towels, I took a toothbrush and got on my hands and knees and scrubbed blood out of the grout in the kitchen tiles. And when I was finished, I took all of the linens and everything that was stained with blood and I put it in a garbage bag and I threw it in the dumpster, which was apparently a huge fuck up on my part. She was very upset at me after this. It's like, okay, I understand that towels are expensive, but what do you think? I'm going to walk into a laundromat with a bunch of bloody towels and say, oh yeah, human blood. Oh, not just anyone, my girlfriend's. So a few hours later, I got a little bit of sleep, and then I went back to pick her up, and I was given a choice. They wanted to admit her, and Caroline was dead set against this because she was convinced that the people at her job would never let her continue to work there if they found out that she was quote unquote crazy. So they told me that they would not admit her provided that I would take personal responsibility for her care. Because of course, I mean, on the one hand, you have dedicated licensed health professionals, and the other hand, you have a 23-year-old waiter. So I took responsibility for her, and we went back to her apartment, and we stared at each other for a couple of hours, and then eventually she fell asleep, and I fell asleep next to her. And I remember thinking to myself, I am in over my head. I can no longer be the guy for this. So I am gonna stick around for another 5 months tops. And then I am out of here. So we dated until summer, right around the time where Caroline was finally able to wear short sleeves. And this time we broke up the right way. We stayed friends. Her mom flew to New York and we packed up a U-Haul together and she moved to Arizona. And eventually she met a college professor and they got married and they have kids and they seemed to be in great spirits. And we actually were friends for a long time. We would talk once a month and I still loved talking to her because we reminded each other of not necessarily a good time, but a different time. I was a reminder of her crazy New York City years, and she was a reminder that at one point in my life I had done something that could be vaguely described as heroic. But at the time, then we actually remained friends until around the time that I got serious with my wife. And I felt like I had to sever things at that point because you can't really move forward with a relationship with your best self if you are still carrying around someone else's shit. Okay, I will admit, I did not realize that. I was informed of that. And eventually it sunk in. Now, that's fine. I mean, I still get to feel like a hero occasionally, even being a married person now. I mean, I've never had to pull my wife out of a bathtub full of blood, but on her behalf, I did go to Costco last week on a Saturday. I have not spoken to Caroline in 15 years. I wouldn't know how to get in touch with her if I wanted to. I suppose there is a vague chance that she might listen to this, and if she does, I just want to say, I hope you're doing well. I hope you're happy. Thank you for letting me be your Sherpa, and I'm glad you called. Thanks.
Hey,